We arrived back at the Seeker base by nightfall. With all the events that had happened and the spike in our adrenaline, I hadn't realized that it actually took several hours to complete our mission. Sometime during the ride, I had crossed my arms. I mentally prepared myself for the mission debrief I'd have to give to the head warrior. Delta noticed my distress and rubbed my arm in comfort. I smiled at him, but quickly looked away as the butterflies in my stomach made me feel nauseous. Unwillingly, I got out of the van. The action was mimicked by Elvira and Fear, who followed me. Gizmo, however, was led away by Olsen, while Predator escorted the mysterious Phantom Woman to the separate section. Delta carried his mother elsewhere. I made my way to the conference room from earlier. I walked over to the computer and punched in the head warrior's personal code. I took in a deep breath and exhaled sharply. I hoped that HQ had a plan. After a couple seconds of processing, the familiar face of Pete came into view on screen.
Agent Moore, what is the situation?
He asked. I've come to give you a mission debrief. I answered calmly.
Good.
He simply said.
What happened?
I turned to look behind me. All of my team members looked back at me with solemn eyes. I felt my professional facade crack a bit, but quickly put it back in place. I focused my attention on the head warrior. We did exactly what the mission parameters instructed us to do. Investigate the lab for any relevant data, and destroy the faculty. None of us, however, anticipated what we found there. The head warrior leaned forward against the screen.
What did you find?
My lips formed into a tight line. We've discovered that some of the victims sent there were cloned. There is also evidence that suggests Phantoms have planted spies within our organization. The head warrior didn't appear surprised.
I suspected as much. What else happened?
We had a close call with a team of Phantoms. It's unclear whether they were killed in the blast or not. I paused to take a breath. We also managed to capture a Phantom agent, I added.
Is that so?
Pete asked in interest.
Have you performed an interrogation yet?
Not yet,
I see.
Pete replied.
Be cautious around the Phantom, so. He may be alone, but Phantom agents are nasty people to deal with.
It's a she, actually, I corrected. The head warrior grunted.
Are there any survivors from the experiments?
Just one, I replied. It's the Guardian's mother. A look of surprise passed over Pete's face.
His mother?
He asked. Skepticism was obvious in his tone.
Are you absolutely sure that is really her?
The Guardian is convinced it's her. He's currently attending to her, I replied.
I see,
Pete said, clearly unhappy about our situation.
Very well. I will present your findings to our allies. Until then, stay on guard. Things are going to get a lot worse before they will get better.
He finished as he rubbed his forehead. Yes, sir, I replied.
Good.
He stated.
Take care, agents. Pete out.
The head warrior's image faded into black, and we were left processing the given information. Olsen eventually came in and took in the tense atmosphere. After a moment of silence, Elvira finally spoke.
The head warrior is right. Things will get worse, won't they?
I met her weary glance and nodded. She sighed and looked away, her morale deflated. My eyes softened at the rare sight of vulnerability in the normally strong woman. As I looked at the other agents, I noticed that they too were feeling down. Even Fear, the smart-ass assassin, who was always stiff as a statue, stood with his shoulders slightly slumped, a clear sign of his dislike of the circumstances. I turned my attention back to Elvira and placed a hand on her shoulder in an attempt to comfort her. Her dull blue eyes met mine. When you joined the Seekers, what did you wish to accomplish? I asked. She blinked at me in surprise, but answered nonetheless.
I wanted to be able to protect the weak.
I nodded. Is there anyone in particular you're fighting for? The weapons expert didn't hesitate in her reply.
I am fighting for my daughter. I want to offer her a world free of phantoms and their threat.
I smiled softly. Then use your daughter as a means to make sure that the phantoms are wiped out for good. You can't give up. Elvira was speechless for a few minutes, but then her eyes lit up in renewed hope as she smiled back. I turned towards Olsen. Hey there, fellow scout. What's your reason for joining the Seekers? The shy agent smiled.
I joined to fight for justice. The world has lost its order, and it's up to us to restore it.
I nodded, and then turned to Predator expectantly. He stated aggressively. I narrowed my eyes in confusion. The way he stated his answer made it seem like he went through a terrible ordeal. I made a mental note to later inquire him about his past. Last but not least was the assassin. I glanced at him with a raised eyebrow as he had his arms crossed and gave me a stubborn look. And you, Fear? What are you fighting for? The assassin continued to hold his ground. I felt a bit annoyed at his lack of respect, but decided that whatever Fear's reasons were, they were too personal for him to openly say. Just when I thought he wouldn't speak, the assassin finally spoke.
I joined the Seekers because I enjoy the fight. As an assassin, I was trained to kill. It is my life. There is nothing else.
I was momentarily stunned at his bluntness. I didn't believe that was truly his reason for joining the Seekers, but I decided to let him be. I turned my attention towards the other agents and stared at all of them equally. There you go. Whatever the reason, we've all joined the Seekers because of one common goal, to take down the Phantoms. We must continue our work if humanity has any chance to have a safe and free future. The people need us, and we have the responsibility to make sure that the Phantoms stay down permanently. My team members were in deep thought as they took in what I said. I nodded at them and walked to the door. Agent Elvira, you will assist me with the interrogation. The rest of you, get some rest.
I'm coming with you,
the demolitions expert exclaimed. I looked at him in confusion once more. Ever since we captured the Phantom Woman, Predator had been acting extremely unusual. He stared at me fiercely as if daring me to say no. Deciding that it'd be too much trouble to stop the guy, I gestured him to follow. As I glanced quickly at Fear and Olsen, both men were looking at Predator in confusion. I stepped into the hall, and the two other agents came into line behind me. I made my way to the room where the Phantom Woman was kept. I nodded at the guard on duty as we arrived. He nodded back and locked the steel door. Predator, Elvira, and I stepped inside. It was a fairly small room. The three of us made it seem even tinier as I began to feel the hint of claustrophobia. I ignored the sensation and focused my sights on the Phantom. Having a better look at her, I finally realized how frail and exhausted she looked. She was dangerously skinny, almost to the point of anorexia. Her cheekbones were hollow and gave her the appearance of a walking skeleton. A nasty black eye painfully clashed against her pale skin. I nearly felt pity for her.
My God,
Predator said quietly.
What happened to you?
The frail woman looked up at him.
More like what didn't happen to me. The Phantoms don't really take care of their own,
she replied, bitterly. I never would have guessed, I thought sarcastically. I stepped in front of the woman. As I'm sure you can tell, you're under interrogation. My colleague here has many ways of making people talk, I said as I gestured to Elvira. She nodded in my direction and stepped to the other side of the Phantom, frowning at her in dislike. The woman looked at Elvira with a slight scowl.
Oh, calm down, Seeker. I'm not going to make this interrogation hard for you. I'll tell you whatever I know.
Well, that's a first, I thought. I pulled out a foldable chair that was leaning against the wall and sat right in front of the Phantom. I suppose we should start at the beginning. How did you get involved with the Phantoms? The woman snorted, much to my annoyance.
It's obvious, isn't it? I'm a clone.
Maybe. Maybe not, I replied. This is the first that we've heard of Phantoms conducting cloning experiments. How did you manage that?
It wasn't very difficult.
The woman started.
Since the 1950s, scientists have been conducting cloning experiments on various animal species. The difficulty we had was preventing the protein necessary for cellular division from being removed.
How did you make up for that flaw? I asked.
We had numerous failed attempts of keeping that protein. Eventually, we were forced to artificially create it, and give it in pills which the clones were obliged to take once a month. Finally, after much trial and error, we succeeded in creating the first human clone.
So those victims you've captured were used as cell donors.
Elvira commented. The Phantom Woman nodded.
Yes. Essentially, we were growing artificial twins.
Confusion filled me. I vaguely remember learning about this in high school biology, but can you explain it more in detail?
About 10 years ago, scientists were making breakthroughs in manipulating the nature of stem cells. There are different types of stem cells that can form various tissue cells. You know about the bone marrow transplant, correct?
I nodded.
It's the same principle. Cells from the bone marrow are injected into a patient that is in need of new cells for various reasons. Some cancer patients even remove their own stem cells and have it frozen during the treatment, only to have it injected back into their bodies once their treatment has been completed.
So those stem cells from the donors were used to create the clones, while the pills were used to supply them with their protein? I asked.
Exactly. Without cellular division, we'd die rather quickly.
I hummed quietly in thought. I then looked at the Phantom. What criteria was there to determine on who got cloned?
The ones who were cloned were considered too valuable to be altered in any way. What exactly qualified them as special, I have no idea. That knowledge was far above my ranking.
Do you know of who you were cloned off of? I asked. The woman shook her head.
No, clones don't have any memories. And that's what makes us so useful to the Phantoms. They program us to do their tasks with no questions.
She replied, surprisingly bitter. I hummed in thoughtfulness. You certainly seem different from the other agents. For one, you're trying not to escape. The Phantom smiled wryly.
I've got nowhere to go, Seeker. Besides, I'm not stupid to try to escape when you've got a guardian and an assassin with you.
You're very observant, I commented, nearly impressed. The woman chuckled darkly.
I'm on my own. I've got enemies on both sides, so of course I've learned to be vigilant. Besides, your ranking system is very similar to that of the Phantoms.
I leaned forward in interest. Do tell. The woman crossed her legs.
We've got the same hierarchy system as you do. The only difference is that the ranks answer to one main authority. The leader prefers to keep his own eye on the progress of each individual agent.
Interesting, I thought. Elvira used that moment as an opportunity to take out the datapad.
We found some intel on the tests that were done here. Care to elaborate?
The Phantom rolled her shoulders.
I was head surgeon, so I know everything that's on that file. Our superiors ordered us to experiment on captured Seeker agents to see whether or not we could bring them over to our side without the need to clone them. That turned out to be a complete failure, though.
Explain, I said expectantly. The woman glanced at me.
I'm not sure if you realize this, but every Seeker agent has a chip implanted in their bodies that releases nanobots whenever the body is affected, whether it be for reparation or as the result from our experiment. That creates a brain hemorrhage.
My eyebrows shot up all the way in surprise. I wasn't aware that we had nanobots inside of us. So cloning the individuals removed the risk of death. The woman nodded.
Correct. It was ruthless, I'll admit, but my superiors wanted results.
And then you implanted those test subjects within the Seekers.
Elvira added. An awkward silence enveloped the small room. I chuckled harshly. You clever bastards, I commented bluntly. You fooled us. A bitter smile formed on the Phantom Woman's face.
Indeed we have. We've been among you for years.
I stared at her blankly, struggling to keep my cool. The Seeker organization was in jeopardy, and it was impossible to tell who was friend or foe. Predator grunted in frustration.
How can you sound so proud of that? Damn it, Diana. I thought you were better than that.
Once again, Predator's behavior toward the Phantom confused me. How did he know her name? Diana met Predator's gaze calmly. I narrowed my eyes at the demolitions expert, like a predator who caught sight of its prey. How do you know each other? I asked. Predator tensed automatically, while the Phantom Woman snorted at his reaction.
Grow a pair, Austin. I'm too tired to tell the story.
Predator sighed heavily and met my gaze with a guarded look. He coughed.
Just a fair warning. You will be shocked at what I have to say. Believe me, it was quite a slap to the face for me when I was first told about it.
He exhaled shakily.
Two years ago, I was sent to a warehouse where there were reports of a bomb. As a demolitions expert, I was in charge of defusing it.
He paused again and allowed Elvira and I to absorb the information before he continued.
The bomb was easily shut off, yet it didn't sit right with me. Not long afterwards, I was captured and sent to a facility similar to the one we investigated.
Diana interrupted.
Warriors brought him in. He was one of the first we experimented on.
Predator nodded.
When I woke up, I found myself tied to an operation table where several of the Phantom surgeons were getting ready for the procedure.
It was a miracle that he didn't die from a brain hemorrhage.
Diana added. I glanced at the Predator, who stared blankly at the woman.
Guess I was lucky.
He replied quietly. The demolitions expert exchanged an indecipherable message with the Phantom. She nodded.
Indeed, you were.
She said.
What was done to you?
Elvira asked after a moment. Predator stared hard at the combat specialist.
They sawed off my arm and used its tissue cells to produce a clone. Once I was back in Seeker hands, I replaced it with an artificial arm that was covered in titanium alloys to give me some extra strength.
Elvira and I gasped as the shocking detail came to light. For a man who went through all that torture, Predator really was quite a cheerful guy. Regardless of our slight hysteria, the demolitions expert went on.
I don't know how or even why it happened, but Diana here nursed me back to health and eventually helped me escape. She said that with my experience at the facility, I would be a symbol of hope in this dark battle.
I raised an eyebrow as I stared at the former surgeon. Why the change of heart? Why did you save Predator? The woman sighed.
Not every Phantom agent is evil as you believe. It's just that we have no choice but to follow our orders. I'm not proud of who I am, or what I've done. I participated in the creation of Predator's clone. I was in charge of his particular experiment, so I took the risk to fake Austin's death and nurse him back to health.
Eventually, Elvira gathered courage to raise the question I wanted to ask.
What happened to your clone?
Her blue eyes analyzed Predator's dark ones.
I don't know.
Predator replied and sighed heavily.
All I know is that he's still out there. Somewhere.
Diana turned to face Predator.
You've got to find him. The Phantoms have great plans in store for him.
Austin nodded and stared back gravely. A strained silence suddenly overtook the room as we all reflected upon the situation. I eventually spoke. Did the Phantoms ever find out about what you did? I asked Diana. A sad smile appeared on her face.
Of course they did, and I'm paying the price for it. However, I don't regret it one bit.
She regarded me with a serious look.
I sincerely hope that you and your organization beat the Phantoms. They've caused enough suffering as it is.
I merely blinked in surprise.
What were you doing in that lab?
Elvira asked. A barely repressed film of emotion showed on the Phantom's otherwise blank eyes. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to maintain control of whatever internal reaction Elvira's question provoked.
I had nowhere else to go,
she replied hoarsely. I nodded impatiently. You already told us that. Why is it that you are forced to go back, though? For once, the former Phantom agent appeared to have been struggling with her reply. Her unusual display of emotion perked my interest. Predator knelt in front of Diana.
You can trust us,
He said in encouragement. Raw emotion exposed itself on the frail woman's warm face as she stared at Pred.
I was trying to protect you.
She responded.
I wanted to find out where Austin's clone got his storage of the protein pill.
I looked at her confused. Don't you all get it from the same supplier? The Phantom woman chuckled slightly.
That would have made my task much easier if it were so. Having several suppliers lowers the possibility of all of our agents' pills being sabotaged.
A small smile came across the woman's face.
I knew I would never have been able to kill Austin's clone one-on-one, so I opted for the only possible option I had.
My eyes widened in disbelief. Diana seemed so protective of Pred, almost like how a woman would fret over her child's well-being. Elvira seemed just as shocked as I was.
Why are you protecting Predator?
She asked. The former Phantom smiled sadly as she stared at Predator's blank face.
I don't understand the reason myself. Only that I have to.
A thick silence suffocated the room then. Neither of us reacted for several minutes. Predator finally spoke.
Come with us. We can protect you, and you'd be a great asset to the Seekers.
The woman grunted.
I bet you would, but my situation's more complicated than you know.
Predator stared at her in confusion. Deciding that we got the information we needed, I stood up and placed an arm on Predator's shoulder. We've learned what we needed to know. Let's go take a break. He nodded wordlessly and followed Elvira out the door. I was about to join them when the woman spoke out once more.
Beware, Seeker. Even some of your so-called teammates might not be who you think they are.
She warned. I turned back and stared at her blankly for a moment. Beneath the haze of her cold eyes was an emotion I couldn't quite pinpoint. It almost appeared like regret. Just as quickly, it was wiped off and a scowl appeared on her face.
Oh, for God's sake, just leave me in peace.
Her outburst snapped me from my thoughts, and I glared at her. I then slammed the door shut and made sure it was locked properly. Didn't need that grumpy woman to escape. I leaned against the nearby wall and sighed. Just when I thought things couldn't have gotten any worse, I realized Elvira and Predator looking at me expectantly. I faced Predator. You alright? I asked. He nodded and gave me a small smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. I sighed again. Go get some rest, guys. Wordlessly, they went on their own ways down the hall. I kicked myself off the wall and walked in the direction they took, not particularly paying attention to anything. As if by fate, I arrived just outside the door to the room where Delta and his mother were occupying. I decided to go in. Hey, I greeted softly. How's she doing? Delta turned his head toward me.
Her vitals are strong, but she's still out cold. I don't know when, if she'll wake up.
He sighed at the last part. His body language displayed his hidden helplessness. I walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. She'll wake up. We did just take her from a phantom lab, so she probably needs more time to regain consciousness. I bit my lip as I tried to formulate what I would say next. Just have faith, John. I whispered the last part. The Guardian's eyes widened as I called him by his real name for the first time.
How did you...
He trailed off. Fear told me. A slip of the tongue, I suppose, I said, and smiled slightly while I withdrew my hand. The Guardian had a dazed look on his face. He quickly recovered and looked at me with the unique intensity that made my stomach do backflips.
What else did he tell you?
I shrugged and leaned on the nearby counter. That was all. We were running for our lives after all. That seemed to have gotten John out of his trance as he shook his head.
I see.
he finally replied.
So what's the verdict?
He asked as he stood beside me and crossed his arms. We're basically on standby until the head warrior gives us our next orders.
Ah,
A long yet comfortable silence overcame the room, as the two of us enjoyed each other's company. I absent-mindedly kicked at my boots, as I paid unnecessarily close attention to the specks of dirt on them. As I slipped my hands into my coat pocket, a foreign weight grazed my fingers. Curious, I grabbed the object and brought it out. Once exposed, I realized that it was the ring. The ring I had found at the ruins of what had once been Madison Square Garden. I twirled it in my hands and studied it under the bright light. Curiously, John looked at my hands.
what's that?
He asked. It's a ring I found during my last mission. Not sure who it belongs to, but there's some Latin inscriptions on it. I can't read it though, I replied.
May I see it?
Seeing no harm in doing that, I placed the ring in his open palm and watched him study it under the light. His eyes narrowed as he focused on the tiny writing. Can you read it? I asked.
I believe I can. If I'm reading this properly, it says, "The day personal identity is lost is a day when man no longer lives."
Oddly enough, I felt deja vu coming about. That's a weird saying, I commented. John nodded and continued to twirl the ring in his gloved hand. Apparently satisfied, he gave it back to me. I slid the ring back into the black hole that was my pocket.
Things are going to get tougher.
John finally said.
After our last mission, it just makes me sick as I think about what other experiments the Phantoms must have done. I just want this war to be over.
I glanced at him. I do too, I agreed. After spending 6 years hunting down possible leads that might have brought us one step closer to stopping the Phantoms, I've had just about enough. I sighed dramatically. This isn't how I pictured spending my young, single years. After that, John chuckled.
Single years, huh? Haven't you ever gone out or something?
I pouted my lips at him playfully. I've had one boyfriend in high school. But that was too immature to be considered something real. Flings don't count either. I want to be in a committed relationship with the right guy, not be forced to do whatever he wants. John raised a delicate eyebrow.
Is that so? Maybe the right guy has been with you all along.
His statement made me stare at him intently, as I looked for any signs of what were his thoughts. Slowly, John lowered his face to my level, and steadily brought his face closer to mine. My mouth parted slightly, as my eyes began to droop lower. Giddiness gripped my insides as butterflies flew in my stomach. Our noses were barely touching when the sound of my phone going off ruined the moment. I jumped as a result, and swiftly took it out. I should probably go. I've got some things to check on. John's eyes widened slightly, and he leaned back.
Yes, of course.
He replied, and sounded a bit abashed. I'll see you later, I said, as I lightly brushed my hand against his. The Guardian finally turned around to look at our touching hands, before he focused his gaze on me. A strange yet welcoming look in his eyes. After a moment of inner debate, I leaned my face toward him and lightly kissed his cheek. His breath halted abruptly. I felt my heart speed up from the simple gesture. I quickly leaned back and gave John a small smile before I walked out of the room. When I turned around, an unfamiliar yet strong emotion took place within me. As I turned around to look back at the still dazed John, reality slapped me across the face as I realized that I was in love with him.